What separates those who thrive in the face of unimaginable suffering from those who collapse under the weight of minor inconveniences? Why do some people seem to possess an inexhaustible drive, while others struggle to get out of bed each morning? And perhaps most importantly, what if the thing we often call laziness isn't actually about a lack of willpower or motivation, but something far more fundamental, something that one man discovered while enduring humanity's darkest hour? These questions were not merely academic for Viktor Frankl. They were matters of life and death, explored in the most brutal laboratory imaginable, the concentration camps of World War II. What Frankl discovered there would not only save his own life, but would go on to revolutionize our understanding of human motivation, meaning, and what we mistakenly label as laziness. Viktor Emil Frankl was born in Vienna in 1905 to a family that valued education and intellectual pursuit. His father was a civil servant in the Ministry of Social Service, and from an early age, Viktor displayed an unusual fascination with the workings of the human mind. As a teenager, he began corresponding with Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, and even had one of his papers published in Freud's International Journal of Psychoanalysis when he was just 17 years old. But Frankl's early exposure to psychological theory would prove insufficient preparation for what lay ahead. In 1942, he, his wife, and his parents were deported to concentration camps. His wife and parents would not survive. Frankl himself would spend the next 3 years in 4 different camps, including the notorious Auschwitz, witnessing horrors that defy human comprehension. Yet it was in this hell on earth that Frankl made his most profound discovery, one that would challenge everything we think we know about motivation, purpose, and human resilience. He observed that some prisoners, despite facing identical conditions of starvation, brutality, and despair, maintained their will to live, while others simply gave up and died. The difference, he realized, wasn't physical strength, intelligence, or even luck. It was something much more elemental. Those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how, Frankl would later write. But this wasn't merely philosophical speculation. It was an observation born from watching human beings either transcend or succumb to the most extreme circumstances imaginable. In the camps, Frankl noticed that prisoners who maintained some sense of meaning, whether it was the hope of reuniting with loved ones, completing important work, or simply bearing witness to what they had experienced, were far more likely to survive than those who had lost all sense of purpose. This wasn't about positive thinking or maintaining hope in some abstract sense. This was about having a fundamental reason for existence that could withstand any external circumstance. One prisoner told Frankl that he could endure anything because he had promised his dying mother he would care for his younger sister after the war. Another sustained himself through months of torture by mentally continuing work on a scientific manuscript the guards had destroyed. Frankl himself survived, in part, by reconstructing his own lost manuscript on psychology, not on paper, which was impossible, but in his mind, keeping alive his purpose of contributing to human understanding. What Frankl discovered in those camps was that human beings are not primarily driven by pleasure, as Freud suggested, or by power, as Alfred Adler proposed, but by meaning. This insight would form the foundation of what he would later call logotherapy, which literally means meaning therapy, and it would revolutionize our understanding of what motivates human action. After liberation, Frankl returned to Vienna and wrote his experiences into a book initially titled A Psychologist Experiences the Concentration Camp. It would later be published as Man's Search for Meaning, becoming one of the most influential books of the 20th century. But the insights contained within its pages extend far beyond the extreme circumstances of the Holocaust. They speak to a fundamental truth about human nature that applies to everyone, including those we might dismiss as simply being lazy. According to Frankl's observations, what we often label as laziness is frequently not a character flaw or lack of willpower, but rather a symptom of what he termed an existential vacuum, a profound absence of meaning that leaves individuals feeling empty, directionless, and unmotivated. When people lack a compelling reason for their actions, when they cannot see how their efforts connect to something larger than themselves, the natural response is not energetic engagement, but rather apathy and inaction. Consider the student who procrastinates endlessly on assignments, not because they're incapable of focus, but because the work feels meaningless to them, or the employee who does the bare minimum not out of inherent laziness, but because they cannot see how their labor contributes to anything they truly value. These individuals aren't broken or deficient. They're experiencing the natural human response to meaninglessness. Frankl observed this phenomenon not only in extreme circumstances, but in the comfortable societies that emerged after the war. He noted that as material prosperity increased and basic survival needs were met, many people found themselves facing what he called Sunday neurosis, a kind of depression that emerged when the distractions of work and routine fell away, leaving individuals alone with the question of what their lives were actually for. The existential vacuum, which is the mass neurosis of the present time, can be described as a private and personal form of nihilism, Frankl wrote. In other words, when people lose sight of meaning, they don't just become sad, they become paralyzed. What looks like laziness from the outside is often the soul's rebellion against meaningless activity. This understanding reframes everything we think we know about motivation and productivity. Traditional approaches to overcoming laziness focus on external motivators, rewards, punishments, discipline, willpower. But Frankl's insights suggest that these approaches often fail because they don't address the root cause, the absence of meaningful connection between action and purpose. The concentration camp prisoners who survived weren't necessarily those with the strongest willpower or the most disciplined minds. They were those who had found or maintained a sense of meaning that could sustain them through unimaginable suffering. Similarly, the individuals who seem naturally motivated and driven in everyday life aren't necessarily those with superior character traits. They're often those who have discovered a sense of purpose that makes their efforts feel worthwhile. This doesn't mean that meaning must be overambitious or world-changing. Frankl emphasized that meaning could be found in the smallest acts and most ordinary circumstances. A concentration camp prisoner might find meaning in sharing his last piece of bread with a fellow prisoner. A factory worker might find meaning in the knowledge that his labor helps provide for his family. A student might find meaning in the connection between her studies and her desire to help others. The key insight is that meaning cannot be given to someone from the outside. It must be discovered or created by each individual. As Frankl put it, everyone has his own specific vocation or mission in life. Everyone must carry out a concrete assignment which demands fulfillment. Therein, he cannot be replaced, nor can his life be repeated. Thus, everyone's task is unique as his specific opportunity to implement it. This recognition leads to a profound shift in how we approach the challenge of motivation. Instead of asking, how can I force myself to do this? The question becomes, how does this connect to what matters to me? Instead of relying on external pressure or discipline, we begin to cultivate internal alignment between our actions and our deepest values. Frankl's logotherapy approach included several techniques for helping individuals discover meaning in their lives. One was the Socratic dialogue, where through careful questioning, people were helped to uncover their own sense of purpose rather than having meaning imposed upon them from outside. Another was encouraging people to look beyond themselves, to find meaning in service to others, in creative work, or in the courage to face unavoidable suffering with dignity. But perhaps most importantly, Frankl emphasized that meaning is not something we possess, but something we must continually choose and create. It's not a destination we arrive at, but a way of being we must constantly recommit to. This understanding transforms laziness from a fixed character trait into a signal, an indication that we may have lost touch with our sense of purpose and need to reconnect with what makes our efforts meaningful. The implications of this perspective extend far beyond individual psychology. In a world where depression, anxiety, and what we might call widespread laziness seem to be increasing despite material prosperity, Frankl's insights suggest that the problem may not be one of comfort or ease, but of meaning. When work feels meaningless, when relationships feel hollow, when achievements feel empty, the natural human response is to withdraw, to become what others might label as lazy. Understanding this dynamic offers hope, because it suggests that the solution to laziness is not more discipline or willpower, but the discovery or creation of meaning. It suggests that the path forward lies not in forcing ourselves to do more, but in connecting what we do to what matters most deeply to us. This doesn't mean that discipline and effort become irrelevant. Frankl himself emphasized that meaning often requires us to transcend comfort and convenience, to choose the difficult path because it aligns with our deepest values. But the effort feels different when it serves a purpose we truly believe in. The discipline feels different when it's chosen rather than imposed. The concentration camp survivor who maintained his will to live, despite unimaginable suffering, wasn't displaying superhuman willpower. He was demonstrating the power of meaning to sustain human action even in the face of extreme adversity. The same principle applies to the seemingly ordinary challenges of daily life. When we know why we're doing something, when we can see how our efforts connect to something larger than ourselves, what once felt like overwhelming obstacles become manageable challenges. Frankl's insights also suggest that meaning is not always comfortable or pleasant. Sometimes the most meaningful path is also the most difficult one. He observed that those who survived the camps were often those who had found meaning not in spite of their suffering, but in response to it. Those who chose to face their circumstances with dignity, to care for others even when they themselves were dying, to maintain their humanity in the face of inhumanity. This points to a profound truth about human nature. We are not primarily seeking comfort or ease, but significance. We want our lives to matter, our efforts to count for something, our existence to have meaning beyond mere survival or pleasure. When this deep need is met, we find reserves of energy and determination we didn't know we possessed. When it's absent, even simple tasks can feel impossibly difficult. As Frankl grew older and continued developing his therapeutic approach, he remained convinced that the search for meaning was the primary human drive. He watched as societies grew more prosperous, but not necessarily happier, as individuals gained more opportunities, but not necessarily more satisfaction. The lesson he drew from these observations was that external circumstances, whether extraordinarily difficult or remarkably comfortable, are less important than our relationship to meaning. Everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way, Frankl wrote. This freedom to choose our response, to find or create meaning even in difficult circumstances, is perhaps the most powerful antidote to what we call laziness. What Frankl discovered in the depths of human suffering was ultimately hopeful, that human beings possess an extraordinary capacity to transcend their circumstances when they have a reason to do so. That what we often dismiss as laziness may actually be the soul's way of saying that something essential is missing. Not energy or ability, but purpose and meaning. The man who spent years in concentration camps, who watched the best and worst of human nature under the most extreme conditions, who lost nearly everything but his life, ultimately concluded that human beings are meaning-seeking creatures above all else. And in that seeking, in that discovery or creation of purpose, lies the key to unlocking the energy and motivation that laziness has obscured. Perhaps the next time we find ourselves or others struggling with motivation, struggling to take action, struggling with what appears to be laziness, we might ask not, how can I force this, but rather, what would make this meaningful? The answer to that question, Frankl suggests, contains within it the power to transform not just our actions, but our entire experience of being alive.